The first time they shot him, it was supposed to be the end. The plasma bolt tore through his chest, burning a hole clear through flesh and bone, leaving the smell of scorched iron in the air. The alien soldiers, sleek, scaled, and bred for war, watched him fall, satisfied that the creature called human had finally stopped moving. But he didn't. He fell to one knee, coughing blood, his eyes dark with fury, and then, slowly, painfully, he stood back up. The aliens had fought on dozens of worlds before, crushed species that screamed and begged, that broke and fled. They'd never seen one of their enemies get up after that kind of wound. The commander barked an order. 6 rifles fired again, white-blue light cutting through the smoke. Bolts hammered his chest, shoulder, and leg, slamming him back against the wall. He dropped once more, exhaling through gritted teeth, and for a moment, the battlefield went silent. Then came the sound that haunted the Enrathi long after the war. The sound of boots scraping against concrete, the slow, terrible rhythm of a human refusing to die. Sergeant Mason Ward didn't know what it meant to surrender. He'd grown up in the slums of New Glasgow, back on Earth, in a city where cold nights and empty stomachs had forged harder steel than any alien weapon could. When the call came that humanity had been evaluated and declared too dangerous to be allowed into the Galactic Council, he'd laughed. When the first bombardment ships appeared over Mars, he'd stopped laughing. But when the Enrathi dropped their armies on Earth and started burning cities, Mason didn't run. He volunteered. He wasn't a hero. He never wanted to be one. He was a soldier who just refused to stop breathing. The battle for Jakarta had lasted 3 weeks. Streets were rivers of glass and ash. Skyscrapers were skeletons glowing red with fire. The humans had no orbital support, no supply lines, no reinforcements. The Enrathi came with walkers, shield drones, and airstrikes that turned entire districts into craters. Still, humanity fought. Mason had lost his squad 3 days ago. Vega, Torres, and little Jin, the kid who still wore his sister's bracelet under his armor. They'd been caught in a plasma storm, burned alive before they could even scream. Mason had found what was left of them in the rubble and buried them with his bare hands. Now he was alone, his armor cracked, his rifle running hot. But he was still fighting, because that's what humans did. The Enrathi called him the Ghost. They said he was unkillable. They said he bled fire and carried the rage of his dying world inside him. Mason didn't believe in legends. He believed in hate. When they found him that night, he was pinned behind a destroyed transport truck, half his ammo gone, and a dozen Enrathi closing in. Their commander, a tall figure with glistening black scales, raised his voice through the translator. "Human," it hissed, "you cannot win. Your world is lost. Your kind is broken. Lay down your weapon, and you may yet die swiftly." Mason spat blood, grinned through cracked teeth, and muttered, "You first." The firefight was chaos. His rifle barked light into the smoke, each burst carving through armor and scale. He moved like a shadow, ducking, rolling, firing, never staying still long enough for them to pin him. Plasma bolts slammed into walls and vehicles, lighting up the street like lightning. One struck his shoulder and spun him around, but he didn't stop. He screamed, a raw animal sound, and charged. The commander didn't expect him to run forward. Humans weren't supposed to be that reckless. Mason slammed into the alien, driving his combat knife between its ribs, twisting hard. The alien shrieked and stumbled back, blood hissing where it hit the ground. Another soldier raised a rifle. Mason snatched it, flipped it, and fired point-blank into the creature's face. By the time the smoke cleared, 8 Enrathi were dead. Mason lay on the ground, bleeding from 3 holes, vision flickering. He dragged himself behind a wall and fumbled for the last stim injector in his belt. He pressed it to his neck and winced as the cold flood hit his veins. His heart hammered, his lungs burned, but he could feel the strength creeping back. He should have been dead, but he wasn't. Why? He whispered to no one, eyes staring up at the ruined skyline. Why the hell won't I die? Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was something deeper. But in that moment, with the city burning around him and the sky split open by alien ships, Mason realized what it meant to be human on a death world like Earth. You didn't live because you wanted to. You lived because you couldn't stop fighting. 3 days later, word began spreading among the Narathi ranks. A human soldier had survived plasma fire, knife wounds, and a bombardment. He'd been seen dragging himself through the ruins, scavenging weapons from the dead, ambushing patrols. Some said he was undead. Others said he was what humans really were, creatures too stubborn for death. The Narathi High Command didn't believe it. They sent a scout drone to confirm. The drone's footage showed a man limping through the wreckage, carrying a plasma rifle almost as big as he was, his armor scorched and torn. He moved with mechanical precision, scavenging, repairing, setting traps. At one point, the footage zoomed in on his face, half-burned, eyes cold and feral. He looked up at the drone and raised his hand. Then he fired. The feed cut to static. When the Narathi officers watched it, no one spoke for a full minute. Commander Kavor, a veteran of a dozen planetary wars, slammed his claws into the table. "One soldier," he growled. "One animal. And it costs us 3 squads? And this." So they sent a hunter unit, 30 of their finest, armed with arc cannons and drones. They combed the ruins for hours, tracking heat signatures, analyzing footprints, scanning for movement. They found nothing. Until night fell. The first sign was the sound of metal scraping above them. One of the soldiers looked up just as a body dropped from the shadows, landing hard. Mason was on him before he could react, slamming a blade into his neck. Plasma flared as he rolled away and opened fire. The night erupted in chaos again, bolts flying, drones shrieking. Mason moved through the dark like a ghost, firing, stabbing, vanishing. They hit him, over and over. His armor shattered. His blood painted the walls. But every time they thought he'd fallen, he rose again. When it was over, 17 Narathi were dead. The rest fled. He sat there in the smoke, trembling, half-conscious. His hand shook as he reloaded. He stared at the alien corpses, at their weapons, and at the reflection of his face in a cracked visor. Barely human anymore, eyes sunken, skin blackened with soot. That's when he heard the whisper through his comm unit. An Earth frequency. "Anyone alive out there? This is Lieutenant Parker, 3rd Armored. We're regrouping near the East Docks. If you can hear this, respond." Mason froze. For a second, he thought it was a hallucination. He clicked his comm. "This is Sergeant Ward. You're real?" "Holy hell, Ward! You're alive?" The voice came back, trembling with disbelief. "We thought you were dead." "Not yet," Mason rasped. "What's the situation?" "The Narathi are pulling back. Something spooked them. We're planning a counter-offensive. Can you make it to us?" Mason looked at the long, burning stretch of city between him and the docks. He should have said no. His body couldn't take another step. But instead, he smiled faintly. "Yeah," he said. "I'll make it." The journey took 2 days. He crawled, limped, fought off drones. He nearly froze one night when the rain turned acid. His stim packs ran out, and he used a belt to stop the bleeding in his leg. When he finally reached the docks, he found a ragged group of soldiers, 20 survivors out of a battalion of 600. They stared when they saw him. "Jesus, Sarge," one whispered. "You look like hell." "I feel worse," Mason said with a grim chuckle. They gave him food, water, and fresh ammo. The lieutenant looked him over and shook his head. "You're the one they've been talking about, aren't you? The ghost." "Guess so," Mason muttered. That night, as they huddled around a fire made from broken drone parts, Parker leaned close. "You know what's funny? The Narathi are scared. They think humans can't die. They've been pulling their wounded out faster than ever." Mason didn't respond. He just stared into the flames, his reflection flickering in his own eyes. He didn't feel like a legend. He felt like a man running out of blood. But if fear was a weapon, he'd use it. And somewhere in the city, watching through hidden drones, the Narathi commanders realized something terrifying. They had faced monsters, predators, and machines. But this was something else entirely. A creature that refused to stop breathing, even when death itself demanded it. A Deathworlder. When dawn broke over the ruins of Jakarta, it was red, not from sunlight, but from the burning clouds of alien ships hanging over the city like vultures. The air tasted of copper and smoke, heavy with the smell of melted metal and blood. Mason Ward woke with his back against a broken pillar, his rifle cradled in his lap, every muscle aching. Around him, what was left of humanity's defense stirred slowly to life. Thin silhouettes of soldiers, faces hollowed by exhaustion but still moving, still breathing. There were 23 of them now, 23 against an empire. And somehow, impossibly, hope had started to flicker again. Parker came over with a ration pack and handed it to him. "You sleep?" Mason shook his head. "Didn't plan to." The lieutenant sighed and sat beside him. "Command's dead. The fleet's gone. But we're not out yet. Intel says the Enrathi have pulled half their ground forces north, probably to regroup. If we hit their fuel convoys and comm hubs, we might just cripple their supply line." Mason tore into the ration pack, grimaced at the taste, and nodded. "And when they hit back?" Parker smirked faintly. "Then we make them bleed." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was enough. The humans still had grit, and Mason was their anchor, the living proof that they could fight gods and not fall. Word had spread through the survivors like wildfire. A soldier who'd taken a plasma bolt through the chest and kept fighting. Some said he'd made a deal with death. Others said he'd just told it to wait. The men followed him now, not because of rank, but because he made them believe in something again. Their first target was a Enrathi supply convoy, moving through the old harbor district. The enemy had turned the port into a staging area. Dozens of shuttles, transport carriers, and drones moving in organized chaos. Parker's squad hid among the ruins, using the skeletal cranes and shattered containers as cover. Mason crawled up beside a cracked concrete barrier and raised his binoculars. 2 carriers, 15 guards, a walker patrol on the flank, he muttered. "If we hit the power core first, we can blow the whole fuel line." Parker frowned. "And how do we get that close?" Mason glanced at him and smiled grimly. "We don't." "I do." Before anyone could argue, he was gone. He moved like a ghost through the shadows, wrapped in smoke and silence. The burns across his side throbbed with every step, but he pushed the pain down deep where it couldn't reach him. He'd learned long ago that pain was just proof you were still alive. The Enrathi guards scanned the area with their gleaming visors, claws clicking on the metal ground. They didn't see him. Humans were small, soft, and weak in their eyes, but they'd forgotten that weakness made them invisible. Mason reached the first carrier and planted 2 explosive charges beneath the fuel tanks. He worked fast, efficient, breathing slow to keep from shaking. Then he slipped toward the second, ducking behind a pile of crates. A voice rasped from his comm, Parker whispering, "You've got movement south side. Patrol's looping early." Mason looked up and saw the glint of armor moving through the fog. He could have turned back. He didn't. He waited, crouched, until the patrol came close enough that he could see the alien's reflection in his knife blade. Then he struck. The kill was silent and brutal. A blade through the throat, a hand over the mouth, a body dragged into the dark. The next soldier turned too late. 2 shots, one to the chest, one to the head. Mason grabbed the alien's plasma rifle and fired into the others. The air exploded with energy, alarms blaring. He ducked, rolled, slammed the detonator. The night erupted. The blast tore the port apart, fire blooming across the sky, shockwaves rattling the ruins. Fuel tanks ignited, drones fell from the air, and the ground trembled like the earth itself was furious. From across the harbor, Parker's team opened fire, cutting down the disoriented guards. Mason staggered from the flames, half blind, coughing smoke. A plasma bolt hit him in the ribs, spinning him sideways, but he stayed upright. He ran through the inferno, bullets of light chasing him, until he dove behind a wall beside Parker. "You insane bastard!" Parker shouted, clapping him on the shoulder. Mason grinned weakly. "Told you it'd work." The lieutenant laughed, a rare sound these days. By sunrise, the port was gone. The Enrathi had lost 2 carriers, 50 soldiers, and enough fuel to ground half their invasion force. Humanity had taken their first victory in weeks. That same day, in orbit above the planet, the Enrathi warlord Kavor watched the reports in disbelief. Destroyed? By what? There were no warships left in this sector. His adjutant hesitated. Not ships, my lord. Humans. A ground unit. One of them led the attack. One? Kavor's voice was low and dangerous. The adjutant nodded. They call him Mason Ward. The others call him the Death Walker. The warlord's crest flared, a sign of anger and unease. Then find him. If this thing lives, it will infect the others with hope. The Enrathi response was swift and merciless. They brought down orbitals, flooded the ruins with drones, and unleashed atmospheric sweepers that turned streets into rivers of molten glass. But humans were rats in the bones of their cities, and Mason was the worst of them all. Every time they closed in, he vanished. Every time they thought they'd cornered him, something exploded. He became a whisper in their communications, a face in their nightmares. They'd see a shadow, a flash of human armor, and panic would ripple through their ranks. One shot, one explosion, and a dozen Enrathi would die. He'd leave behind crude graffiti scrawled in human blood or ash, "Still here." To the soldiers fighting beside him, Mason was no longer just a man. He was the embodiment of their rage, the proof that death wasn't strong enough to break them. But the cost was eating him alive. The wounds that never healed, the stim overuse, the nightmares that clawed at his mind whenever he closed his eyes. Sometimes he'd wake up shaking, clutching his rifle, thinking he was still in the fire. Parker noticed it. "You can't keep this up, Mason," he said one night as they rested in an abandoned metro tunnel. "You'll burn out." Mason stared at the ceiling, eyes hollow. "Maybe, but not before they do." Then came the message that changed everything. A resistance broadcast intercepted from orbit. Earth Command had re-established contact. Somewhere in the Northern Territories, survivors had rallied and built a hidden base. They were preparing a counterstrike. Mason and Parker's unit were ordered to move north and link up. It was the first real directive in months. The journey was hell. They crossed what was left of the mountains on foot, through acid rain and snow that stung like glass. They lost 3 men to exposure, 2 more to drones. By the time they reached the old Siberian trench lines, there were only 10 of them left. But waiting for them was something neither expected. Humans. Dozens, then hundreds. Engineers, medics, soldiers from across shattered continents, all gathered beneath the broken satellites that once guided the world. And in the middle of it all, a banner hung over a command post. Project Phoenix. General Alana Reyes greeted them personally. She was a small woman, her hair streaked with gray, but her eyes burned with the same impossible defiance Mason carried. When she saw him, she froze. "You're the one they talk about," she said softly. "The man who wouldn't die." Mason shrugged. "Rumors get big in ruins." Reyes smiled faintly. "Maybe, but the Enrathi believe them. And that's worth more than any weapon." The base was alive with movement. Humans were rebuilding drones, hacking alien tech, reforging scavenged metal into armor and artillery. It wasn't much, but it was human ingenuity in its purest form. They'd turned desperation into invention. Reyes showed Mason a table littered with alien schematics. "We've learned a lot from their tech. Energy rifles, shield arrays, neural systems. But there's one thing we've got they'll never understand." Mason glanced up. "What's that?" "Purpose," she said simply. Over the next weeks, Mason trained new recruits. He taught them how to fight in the ruins, how to adapt, how to weaponize survival itself. He never spoke about the pain, the sleepless nights, the scars. He didn't need to. The younger soldiers saw the way he moved, the way he never hesitated, and they followed. Then came the day the Enrathi found them. It started with static over the comms, then a low tremor that rolled through the ground. Within minutes, the sky split open with light. Dropships poured out like hornets. Alarms blared, orders shouted. Reyes looked to Mason. "You wanted to make them bleed? This is your chance." He grabbed his rifle and stepped out into the snow, the wind whipping against his armor. The horizon burned blue with plasma fire, and the air trembled with the roar of alien engines. He looked at the terrified faces around him, boys and girls, half-trained and starving, and something inside him hardened. "Listen up," he barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. "They think we're broken. They think death scares us. They forgot where we come from." He raised his weapon, the barrel glowing faintly in the cold light. "We're from Earth, a death world. We don't die easy." The soldiers rallied, shouting, the fear in their eyes replaced by fire. And when the first wave hit, Mason was already moving. Plasma bolts lit the snow around him as he charged into the fray. He tore through their lines like a storm, firing, reloading, shouting orders. Drones swarmed overhead. He shot them down one by one. The Enrathi Walker advanced, its cannon charging, but Mason ran straight toward it, leapt onto its hull, and jammed a grenade into its vent. The explosion hurled him backward, but he landed on his feet, staggering, bleeding, and still alive. From the command post, Reyes watched in disbelief. "No weapon can kill him," she murmured. And in that frozen battlefield, surrounded by fire and ash, Mason Ward screamed into the storm, defying the galaxy itself to try again. The snow burned blue that day, lit by the hellfire of plasma bolts and the fury of desperate men. Mason Ward moved through it like a revenant, smoke and blood trailing behind him, his breath fogging in the freezing air. The ground shook as Enrathi walkers advanced, massive insectile machines spitting energy across the battlefield. Behind him, human soldiers scrambled in the trenches, their weapons crude but relentless. The first line of defense was collapsing. Bodies lay half-buried in the snow, steam rising where the heat met the cold. Still, they didn't retreat. They couldn't. Because Mason didn't. Every time he rose again, dragging himself through pain that would have killed anyone else, the others followed. It wasn't courage anymore, it was contagion. The Deathworlder's defiance had become a virus, spreading through hearts and bones until every human on that line believed that dying was optional. Mason's visor flickered with static as he shouted into comms, "Left flank, move! Don't let them circle!" Parker's voice crackled back. "Walker incoming, 30 meters." Mason turned, eyes locking on the massive silhouette emerging through the storm. The machine's cannon charged, glowing with deadly blue light. He didn't think, didn't plan. He ran. The world became sound and motion, snow kicking up beneath his boots, each step heavier than the last. He vaulted over a corpse, slid under falling debris, and reached the walker's leg. His rifle was out of charge, but he still had one trick left. He pulled a thermal grenade, ripped the pin with his teeth, and slammed it into the joint. The explosion hurled him backward, metal and fire raining down. The walker shuddered, toppled, and crashed into the ice with a scream of torn metal. Mason hit the ground hard, his ears ringing, his leg twisted at a wrong angle. He should have blacked out. Instead, he dragged himself upright, wrenched the bone back into place with a snarl, and limped toward the next fight. Reyes watched from the command tower, her hands gripping the console so hard her knuckles bled. "How is he still moving?" she whispered. A comms officer beside her said nothing, just stared, eyes wide with something between awe and horror. On the alien flagship above the battlefield, war leader Kavor watched the same scene through a live combat feed. He had seen 1,000 battles, 1,000 species crushed under Enrathi firepower. None of them had done this. None of them had gotten up after this much death. His claws scraped the edge of the control table. "Magnify," he growled. The image zoomed in on Mason, blood dripping down his cheek, armor blackened, one eye swollen shut, yet still fighting. "How?" Kavor hissed. The science officer hesitated. "Their biology is unstable. They adapt rapidly. But this one, he's beyond adaptation. He's something else." "Then destroy him," Kavor snapped. "Send every drone in orbit if you must." And so the sky fell again. Mason saw it first, the air above him shimmering as orbital drones descended, black dots spreading across the gray horizon like a swarm of hornets. "Reyes!" he shouted into comms. "They're bringing down the hive." The general's voice came back sharp. "Fall back to the second line." "We'll cover." Mason looked around. Half his people were wounded, the rest too scared to move. Fall back? Not while those drones were still above them. He grabbed the shoulder of a young private, barely 18. "Get your team to the tunnels, now." "What about you?" the boy asked. Mason smiled grimly. "I'll keep the sky busy." He scavenged a launcher from a fallen trooper, propped it on a broken wall, and started firing. One drone went down, then another. He reloaded between breaths, his body trembling from adrenaline and blood loss. The drones retaliated, raining fire. The snow exploded around him, waves of plasma tearing apart everything he touched. He didn't stop. His armor melted in places. His hands blistered, but he kept reloading. Behind him, the survivors managed to retreat into the trenches, dragging the wounded. When his launcher finally ran dry, Mason stood there panting, surrounded by fire. Above him, dozens of drones still hovered, weapons glowing like miniature suns. "Come on then," he muttered. "Do it!" The drones opened fire all at once. The world vanished in light. Reyes screamed his name over the comms, but the signal was gone. For a full minute, there was only static. The drones hovered over a crater where Mason had stood, scanning for heat signatures. Then one of them jerked. Something moved. Through the flames, a figure rose slowly, armor blackened, skin seared. A faint blue glow flickering from a cracked helmet. Mason Ward was still alive. Barely. His lungs burned with each breath. His skin felt like it was on fire. But he moved. One step, then another. The drones hesitated, recalibrating, and that hesitation cost them. The humans opened up from the trench line, missiles streaking through the air. The drones fell one by one, and the tide began to turn. By nightfall, the snow had stopped burning. The battlefield was silent except for the groans of the wounded. Mason lay in the ruins, staring up at the dark sky. He couldn't feel his left arm anymore. He could barely see. But the comm in his helmet crackled, and Parker's voice broke through, hoarse but alive. "Mason, you did it. They're retreating." Mason tried to laugh, but it came out as a cough. "Yeah? Tell him not to run too far. I'm not done yet." When they found him hours later, the medics thought he was dead. His vitals were faint, his body covered in burns. They carried him into the underground base, stripped off his armor, and hooked him to every machine they had. For 3 days, he didn't wake. Reyes sat beside him, refusing to leave, her face drawn tight with guilt. On the 4th day, his fingers twitched. On the 5th, his eyes opened. "Welcome back, Ghost," Reyes said softly. Mason blinked, his throat dry as sandpaper. "How long was I out?" "Long enough," she replied. "You scared the galaxy." She wasn't wrong. The footage of that battle had leaked through a captured Enrathi channel, spreading like wildfire across systems. Billions watched in disbelief as a single human refused to die, standing against impossible odds. Across the stars, whispers began. The Deathworlders, they said, cannot be killed. The Deathworlders endure. For the first time, alien species who'd dismissed humanity as savages began to reconsider. Small resistance cells on occupied worlds adopted human tactics: hit, vanish, hit again. Some even painted crude human faces on their armor as symbols of rebellion. The Enrathi called it contagion warfare, the spread of belief through fear. Their warlords tried to suppress it, but it only grew. Meanwhile, on Earth, Mason healed slowly. His left arm was replaced with a mechanical graft, his skin a patchwork of scars. But his mind was sharp, sharper than before. Reyes approached him one night, a holographic map flickering between them. "They're scared," she said. "They've pulled half their fleet from orbit. If we strike now, Mars, Luna, orbital stations, we can push them off the system." Mason studied the map, his jaw tightening. "We'll need every fighter, every drone, every body." "We have them," Reyes said. "Because of you." He didn't like the sound of that. He hadn't fought to become an idol. He'd fought because someone had to. But if his story could scare an empire, he'd use it. "Then let's finish it," he said. The offensive began 2 weeks later. Humanity's remnants rose from their ashes. Drones hacked, ships cobbled together from wreckage, soldiers wearing armor that barely held together. But they launched anyway. Mason led the ground assault, as always, a black silhouette at the front of the charge. The Enrathi met them with overwhelming firepower, but something had changed. The humans didn't break this time. They roared, laughed, bled, and kept coming. Every time one fell, another rose. It was madness, beautiful and terrifying. In orbit, Kavor watched as his fleets began to crumble. Reports came in. Ships hijacked, commanders dead, humans boarding cruisers with explosives strapped to their chests. "They're insane," one officer cried. "They don't fear death." Cavor slammed his fist down. "Then remind them why they should." He ordered a final strike. A kinetic bombardment targeting the last human stronghold. The payload dropped from orbit, streaking through the clouds. Reyes saw it first on radar. "Mason, it's coming straight for us!" Mason looked up, saw the glowing line across the sky, and didn't think twice. He sprinted toward the forward batteries, shouting for the artillery crew. "Target the drop. Full barrage." They hesitated only a second before obeying. The guns fired, shells screaming upward. The kinetic weapon hit the first volley, detonated prematurely. The shockwave flattened everything for miles. When the dust settled, the command post was gone. Reyes was alive, barely. Parker was digging through debris, shouting Mason's name. They found him half buried under the wreckage, armor shattered, heartbeat weak. Reyes knelt beside him, tears mixing with the blood on her hands. "You saved us again," she whispered. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, the ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Still here," he rasped. Then he went still. For hours, no one moved. The humans buried him beneath the frozen soil, wrapped in the torn flag of Earth. Reyes gave the final salute. But even as they mourned, the Enrathi fleet began to withdraw. Word had spread that Mason Ward, the unkillable Deathworlder, had fallen. But the fear didn't fade. It deepened. Because if one man could do all that, what would happen when the rest of humanity rose behind him? 3 days later, in a med bay deep beneath the base, a faint beeping started on a long silent monitor. One heartbeat, then another. A medic rushed in, eyes wide. "General, you'd better come see this." Reyes entered, and for a long moment she couldn't speak. On the table, beneath the bandages and machines, Mason Ward's fingers twitched. His chest rose, shallow but steady. His eyes opened slowly, pale and fierce. "Welcome back," Reyes said, voice trembling. He smiled weakly. "Told you, Death's gonna have to try harder." When Mason Ward opened his eyes again, he thought he was in hell. Everything was white, humming, and painfully bright. The air smelled of antiseptic and steel. His body didn't feel like his own. Half of it was metal, half of it pain. Tubes ran from his veins, machines beeped softly nearby, and when he tried to move, his ribs screamed. For a long while he lay there, listening to the sound of his heart. Slow, steady, impossible. Then the memories came back like shrapnel. The bombardment, the flash of light, the crater, the silence. He should have been dead. Again. But somehow the universe had decided it wasn't finished with him. He turned his head, wincing at the stiffness, and saw General Reyes sitting nearby, eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion. She smiled faintly when she saw him stir. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" she murmured. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry. She poured water, helped him sip. The first words that rasped out of him were barely a whisper. "How bad?" Reyes looked at the monitors. "Bad. You were buried for 3 days. We almost gave up." "And the war?" he croaked. "Still going. But you broke them, Mason. The Enrathi pulled their orbital fleets out of our skies. They're regrouping farther out, trying to figure out how to fight something that won't die." He managed a weak grin. "Good. Let them think about it." Over the next weeks, Mason recovered in silence, his body slowly remembering how to function. The medics called it a miracle. He called it spite. His mechanical arm responded sluggishly at first, but soon he could grip, lift, reload. His new ribs ached like fire whenever he breathed too hard, but that just meant he was alive. Sometimes, at night, he'd wake drenched in sweat, certain he was back in the fire again, certain the world was ending. Reyes would visit those nights, sit beside him without saying anything. She didn't need to. He could see in her eyes that she'd lost as much as he had. The difference was, she'd chosen to keep going too. Outside, humanity was changing. The legend of the Deathworlder had spread across the galaxy. Videos, intercepted communications, rumors, they all told of a single soldier who refused to die, who spat in the face of alien gods and made them bleed. On occupied worlds, enslaved species whispered his name. On trading stations, merchants who once mocked Earth began to paint crude human skulls on their hulls for luck. The Enrathi propaganda division tried to suppress it, labeling Mason a bioweapon experiment, a fabrication, a lie. But it was too late. Fear had roots now. And for the first time in centuries, the galaxy realized that death didn't scare the species from Earth. It motivated them. Mason learned all this secondhand, through reports Reyes left by his bedside. He read them quietly, then folded them away. He didn't think of himself as a symbol. He thought of Jin, Vega, Torres, the squad he'd lost back in Jakarta, and wondered what they'd think of what he'd become. He wasn't sure he liked the answer, but he knew what came next. "We have to take it to them," he told Reyes one evening, voice still rough. "If they regroup, they'll come back with everything they've got." "We can't wait," Reyes sighed. "We're rebuilding as fast as we can. But we don't have the ships, the numbers." "We've got something better," he cut in. "They're scared. Use it." And so they did. Project Phoenix expanded into something the Enrathi had no word for. A rebellion born from despair, fueled by rage, led by ghosts. Humans hacked Enrathi comms, sending messages across systems. Earth still fights. They hijacked broadcasts to show footage of survivors, of cities slowly rising from ashes. The galaxy watched in disbelief as humanity crawled from extinction with a grin full of blood and teeth. When Mason was finally cleared for duty, the base turned silent as he stepped into the hangar. The soldiers stopped what they were doing, staring at him like they were seeing a myth walk. His armor was reforged, heavier now, reinforced with Enrathi alloy. His left arm gleamed under the lights, humming faintly as he flexed it. Parker was waiting near the transport bay, grinning. "About time, old man." "Old man?" Mason smirked. "Pretty big talk from someone who still shoots like a stormtrooper." Parker laughed, clapped him on the shoulder. For a moment it felt like before. Before the ashes. Before the myth. Then the sirens blared again, and the moment was gone. The Enrathi had found them. Reyes barked orders across the command floor, screens lighting up with orbital trajectories. "Scout ships, 6 of them. They're scanning the ice fields." Mason was already moving toward the launch platform. "You can't go up there," Reyes snapped. "We need you alive." "You need them dead," he countered. "You said it yourself. They're scared of me. Let's remind them why." Before she could argue, he was gone, boarding one of the captured alien gunships. Parker followed without hesitation. "You're not leaving me to babysit the base," he said. Mason grunted. "Then strap in." The ship roared to life, engines howling as they lifted into the storm. The frozen horizon fell away beneath them, replaced by endless clouds and the faint shimmer of stars beyond. The Enrathi scouts appeared on sensors, sleek, curved vessels moving in perfect formation. "They'll spot us soon," Parker said. Mason checked the weapon systems, a Predator's calm settling over him. "Good." The gunship burst from the clouds, plasma turrets blazing. The first Enrathi scout never had a chance. Its shields flared, failed, and it spiraled into the atmosphere trailing fire. The others scattered, returning fire. Mason spun the ship through their barrage, metal screaming under the pressure. One hit scorched their wing, alarms flaring. Parker cursed. "We can't take much more." "We won't have to," Mason said, flipping the last safety cover. Targeting their lead. The gunship's main cannon charged, light filling the cockpit. Mason locked on and fired. The beam punched through space, slicing the scout clean in half. The explosion lit the night sky like a second sun. But victory came at a cost. Their ship caught debris, engines stuttering. "We're losing power," Parker shouted. Mason fought the controls, but the thrusters failed, gravity clawing them back down. They crashed hard in the ice fields, the hull splitting open. Parker groaned, bleeding from the head. Mason dragged him out just as the wreckage went up in flames. Above them, 2 surviving scouts circled back, descending. "Looks like they're not done," Parker muttered, reaching for his rifle. Mason smirked. "Neither am I." The next 10 minutes were chaos. Plasma bolts carved the snow. Explosions painted the ice orange. Mason fired until his rifle overheated, then switched to his sidearm. When that ran dry, he used his knife. The air shimmered with heat and fury. One of the scouts landed, doors opening as Enrathi soldiers poured out, tall, armored, elegant in their efficiency. Mason met them head-on, cutting through the first line like a storm given flesh. A plasma blade caught his side, burning deep. He didn't stop. He grabbed the alien, twisted, and drove his knife through its throat. Parker went down beside him, hit in the chest. Mason turned, rage exploding out of him, and charged into the second squad. He didn't remember the next few moments clearly, just blood, screams, light. When it ended, the snow was silent again. Bodies lay scattered across the ice, and Mason stood alone, shaking, barely upright. His vision blurred, but he was still breathing, always breathing. A transmission crackled in his ear. Reyes's voice. "Mason, do you copy? Mason, talk to me." He clicked his comm, coughing. "Still here." Relief flooded her voice. "We saw the explosions. Are you alive?" he interrupted. "Mostly. We're sending evac." "Negative. If there are survivors in orbit, they'll track the signal. I'll find my own way back." He shut the comm off, looking at the frozen wasteland around him. The wreckage of the Enrathi scouts burned in the distance, their black metal hissing against the ice. He limped toward the nearest one, forced open the hatch, and climbed inside. The cockpit was alien, full of symbols he didn't recognize. But he'd learned enough from captured tech. He found the pilot's chair slumped and broken and pushed the body aside. The ship groaned as he brought the systems online. Its navigation was damaged, but he could make it fly. As the engines warmed, he stared out through the cracked viewport at the stars above. Somewhere out there, an entire empire was trembling because a man like him existed. He didn't know if that made him proud or sick. Maybe both. He flew the captured scout back through the storm, guiding it low over the horizon to avoid detection. The base came into view like a scar across the ice, half buried and burning from earlier bombardment. He landed rough, metal screaming as it scraped against rock. The hangar doors opened, soldiers rushing to meet him. When he stepped out, bruised and limping, the cheering started again. It wasn't the sound of victory. It was the sound of survival. Reyes met him at the edge of the bay. "You're supposed to be resting," she said, half laughing, half crying. "You know me," he said. "I don't rest." That night, the humans gathered around a fire outside the base, the first real moment of warmth they'd felt in years. Mason sat a little apart from them, staring at the sky. Parker was in the med bay, stable but unconscious. Reyes joined him quietly, holding a flask. "You scared them again," she said. He nodded. "Good. You realize what you've become?" she asked softly. "They're building statues, Mason, songs. Whole fleets paint your emblem on their hulls." He looked at her, the flames reflecting in his eyes. "I didn't ask for any of that." "No," she said. "But they need it." Mason didn't answer. He looked at the stars again, at the faint trails of ships moving far above. Somewhere out there, the Enrathi were watching, regrouping, whispering in fear. He wondered if they understood what made humans different. Not strength, not technology, just refusal. You could crush their bodies, burn their cities, poison their skies, and they'd still crawl from the ashes, grinning through broken teeth, ready to fight again. When the wind shifted, carrying the scent of frost and fire, Mason smiled faintly. "Let them come," he whispered. "I'll be waiting." The final winter on Europa's ice plains came hard and unrelenting, a storm that blotted out the stars and turned the human outpost into a frozen scar beneath heaven's fury. Mason Ward stood in the snow, visor up, letting the sting of ice bite his skin. The radio crackled faintly in his ear. Reyes's voice, calm but tight. "They're coming, Mason. Fleet-wide transmission confirms it. Full Enrathi Armada. Every ship they've got." He said nothing for a long time, watching the black horizon. The clouds were pulsing faintly, flashes of light from orbit where the first waves of plasma fire already burned against the upper atmosphere. The sky looked like a wound. He breathed in slow, steady, his breath fogging against the cold. "Then this is it," he said softly. "The last dance." Reyes's voice lowered. "You don't have to be out there alone." He smiled faintly. You know I do. When he returned to the base, every soldier he passed straightened, saluting with eyes that burned like his. Not from fear, but from the kind of certainty only desperation breeds. They knew what was coming. The Enrathi weren't sending scouts or raids anymore. They were bringing extinction. Mason moved through them without a word, checking defenses, inspecting weapons, nodding where words would fail. Parker was there too, pale but alive, his chest wrapped in bandages. "I hear the bastards brought friends," he said with a crooked grin. Mason clapped his shoulder. "Good. Saves us the trouble of chasing them later." Parker's laughter broke the tension like sunlight through storm clouds. For a brief second they were just soldiers again. Tired, hungry, angry, but alive. The hours that followed were a blur of preparation. Drones swarmed overhead, repairing what they could. Shield emitters hummed weakly. Ammunition was counted, rationed, kissed for luck. In the command chamber, Reyes stood before the hollow display of the system. Dots of blue marking human defenses, red swarming like blood. "They outnumber us 100-1, she said quietly. "Even if we destroy their first wave, more will come. This might be it." Mason looked at the map, then at her. "Then make it count. We'll show them what a Deathworlder war looks like." And when the Enrathi arrived, the stars themselves seemed to scream. Their ships filled the sky, thousands of them black and glimmering like knives. The first orbital bombardment tore across the surface, melting ice into oceans of steam. Mason and his men huddled in trenches that glowed from heat, the ground trembling beneath their boots. "Hold fire!" he shouted over the roar, his voice carrying through the comms. "Wait till they touch ground!" The Enrathi landed in shimmering dropships, sleek and silent, fanning out in precise formations. The air smelled of ozone and ash. Then Mason gave the order. "Now!" The ice exploded. Hidden artillery, buried deep in the crust, came alive. Massive kinetic railguns firing tungsten slugs through the air with thunderous force. Enrathi dropships shattered mid-descent. Alien troops vaporized before they could even aim. Human fighters streaked through the storm, firing homemade missiles and salvaged plasma torpedoes. From the observation deck, Reyes watched as the impossible unfolded. A handful of human survivors holding against the most advanced empire in known space. For the first time in the war, the Enrathi hesitated. And hesitation, Mason had once said, was the prelude to death. He led from the front, of course. He always did. His armor bore the scars of every battle he'd refused to die in. His voice echoed over the comms, fierce and raw. "You wanted a death world, you got one. Now fight for your lives, you alien sons of—" The rest was drowned out by the roar of explosion as he hurled himself into the fray. Plasma fire carved the air around him. He ducked, rolled, fired. The Enrathi were fast, elegant killers with weapons that burned holes through steel. But they'd never fought humans like this, not on a planet that hated everything that lived. The ice cracked, geysers erupted, avalanches thundered from ridges. Mason used it all, turning the world itself into a weapon. He fought beside Parker, who cursed joyously between bursts of gunfire. "You know," Parker shouted, "when this is over, I'm retiring to somewhere warm." "You'll freeze before that," Mason grunted, firing through an alien's faceplate. "Then you're buying the drinks in hell." Hours bled into each other. The battlefield was a nightmare of smoke and light. Whole units vanished under bombardment. The air turned metallic from blood and ash. Mason's comms were a storm of voices. Calls for medics, reports of flanking maneuvers, screams cut short. But through it all, humanity refused to break. Every time a line faltered, someone filled it. Every time a stronghold fell, survivors regrouped and fought from the ruins. They were too stubborn, too furious, too human to stop. Then the second wave hit. Heavier ships, orbital cannons cutting craters into the planet's surface. Mason's earpiece crackled. Reyes's voice again strained. "They've breached the western ridge. If they get past that line—" "They won't," Mason growled, already moving. He sprinted through the wreckage, lungs burning, ice breaking beneath his boots. The ridge loomed ahead. What was left of it? Smoke poured from the trenches, bodies strewn across the snow. The Enrathi were advancing in tight formation, shields flickering. Mason vaulted over the barricade and charged. "Ward, wait!" someone shouted. But he didn't hear. He was beyond pain now, beyond fear. He was the legend they'd made of him, a ghost wrapped in iron and fury. He hit their line like a meteor. The first Enrathi fell, its armor split open by a single punch from Mason's metal fist. He tore through them, rifle in one hand, blade in the other. They shot him again and again, plasma rounds burning through his armor, cutting deep. But he kept moving. His blood steamed in the cold air, turning to crimson mist around him. Somewhere behind him, humans rallied, shouting his name. The Deathworlder, the unkillable man. And in that instant, even the Enrathi wavered. Their commander, a towering alien clad in silver armor, stepped forward. "You cannot win," it said in perfect human speech, voice echoing through translation circuits. Mason spat blood, lifted his rifle. "That's the thing about humans," he said. "We don't fight to win. We fight because you gave us a reason." The alien raised its weapon, but Mason was faster. He fired point blank, the recoil slamming through his shoulder. The commander fell, armor cracking like glass. The Enrathi line faltered. The humans surged. For a moment, victory seemed possible. But then the sky opened. A beam from orbit struck the ridge, turning everything to molten fire. Mason was thrown backward, armor melting. The world became light and pain. He heard Reyes screaming his name through static. He tried to move, couldn't. His systems failed one by one. His heart staggered, then steadied. He wasn't dead, not yet. Through the glare, he saw the massive Enrathi dreadnought descending, its shadow blotting out the stars. It was beautiful in a way. The death of worlds made into art. Mason dragged himself upright, vision tunneling. "Reyes," he croaked. "Target that dreadnought." "Mason, it's impossible." "Do it," he said, voice like steel. "Use the geothermal vents. Overload the reactors. Make this rock explode if you have to." Silence. Then her voice, quiet and fierce. "Copy that." He limped toward the ridge's edge, overlooking the sea of alien troops. They were regrouping now, forming up again, confident that nothing could survive that blast. He raised his rifle, though his arm shook so hard he could barely aim. "Come on, you bastards," he whispered. "One more round." The rifle clicked empty. He laughed, a dry, broken sound, and drew his knife instead. The blade glinted in the firelight. Behind him, deep below the surface, the reactors began to roar. The vents split open, geysers of light shooting skyward. The Enrathi noticed too late. The ground shook, the air turned to fire, and Europa screamed as its core detonated. The dreadnought above tried to rise, engines flaring, but the blast caught it, a sun born from the ice, tearing it apart in blinding brilliance. When the light faded, there was silence. Days later, search teams from the outer colonies found the wreckage drifting through space. What they discovered became legend. A scorched suit of armor fused to alien steel, a human skeleton still gripping a knife. The story spread across the stars, whispered in every language. The tale of the man who refused to die, who burned a world rather than surrender it. And somewhere in the quiet edges of the galaxy, the surviving Enrathi lords swore they could still hear his voice in their nightmares. Earth rebuilt. Slowly, painfully, beautifully. Children born in the new colonies learned his name before they learned history. Statues rose on the home world. Not of gods or kings, but of a soldier standing in the snow, head bowed, as if listening to the wind. Reyes retired to a farm on Mars, but sometimes she'd look up at the night sky and whisper, "You did it, Mason. You mad. Stubborn bastard." Parker ran a bar on Luna Base, and every glass he poured, he raised to the empty chair by the corner window, and so the galaxy moved on but never forgot. Because legends like Deathworlders don't die. They wait. They watch. They remind the stars that once upon a time, on a tiny, violent planet that should never have birthed life, a creature stood against extinction and said, "No, not today."